Okay. I will still wait 1 minute and then we get started. Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to all of you on behalf of the Delhi-based Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, IPCS, the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, Clingendael, and its Planetary Security Initiative team. This online event, which is also live streamed on YouTube, will discuss climate security in the Bay of Bengal region that is strategically positioned in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Louise van Schijk, and I'm head of unit at the Clingendael Institute in the Netherlands, and I'm one of the moderators of today. My co-moderator is Rui Niuk. She's the director of IPCS and currently based at the Belfer Center, temporarily, of the Harvard University. So it is quite early in the morning for her in US time. I will outline the setup of this event, and Director Niuk will say a few words about our joint project and its objectives. At Clingendael, we host the Planetary Security Initiative, PSI, since 2016. PSI aims to reduce climate-related threats and risks to stability, thus promoting sustainable peace in a changing climate. For instance, in June 2021, we organized a live meeting in the south of Iraq, where we foster climate security dialogue with local stakeholders. And on our website, for example, you can find an overview of climate security practices, activities to use climate security insights for peace building and conflict prevention. Clingendael is interested in climate security from both a hard and human security perspective, and aims to serve diplomats, defense, and development experts in their work on climate security. The website and PSI newsletter serve as a hub of policy relevant information. Today, we aim to have an open and interactive discussion on how climate security is relevant for Southern Asia and its wider implications for geopolitics. We will first discuss the findings of our new report, Climate Security in the Bay of Bengal, with the authors of the report. Subsequently, we will discuss the implications of the work for foreign policy and the geopolitical developments in the region. And therefore, we have established a panel with 4 fantastic speakers. His Excellency Manjeev Singh Puri, the former ambassador of India to the EU, deputy representative to the UN, and also lead climate negotiator for India. His Excellency Riaz Hamidullah, the ambassador of Bangladesh to the Netherlands, and also former climate negotiator and senior diplomat at the ministry in Bangladesh. Meli Caballero Anthony, she is the head of the Center for Non-Traditional Security at Nanyang Technical University in Singapore. And Florian Kramper, the Director for Climate Change and Risk Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, in Sweden. The panel will be moderated by Rui Niuk, and I will now give the floor to her to introduce our collaboration on climate security in Southern Asia. But before that, I would also like to mention to you that after her intervention, we have a few poll questions for you, the audience. And also I will interview briefly the authors of the report on climate security. Throughout this event, Zoom participants can participate in this poll, but they can also post questions in the Q&A. And some of you have already handed in questions upon registrations that we will also try to use for the event. So thank you for posing your questions and your interest. That's very helpful also for us. All right, Rui, now I would like to give the floor to you, please.
Thank you very much, Louisa. I will echo your words of welcome. On behalf of IPCS and Clingendael, I am grateful to our distinguished panelists, the audience, and of course, our colleagues, the authors of the report we're launching today, for being here. So thank you again. Now, my role really is to supplement Louisa's excellent overview with some specific observations about our joint project. What I will say, of course, is that the report, this particular report, has been deeply researched over many months nearly a year, in fact, and it contains several original insights on what climate security looks like in the Bay of Bengal. The authors will explain in more detail why we chose the Bay of Bengal specifically. Further, the report has sought to understand how different institutions and countries in the region perceive climate security, what they think the issue areas within this framework are. And based on that, we have tried, or rather the authors have tried to conclude whether there is any room for regional cooperation, which we will bring up for discussion, I think, both in the authors roundtable as well as the panelists' interventions. Now, this report, as I mentioned earlier, is part of the larger IPCS and Clingendael research project, I should mention, on climate change and security in South Asia. And we began this in January last year. And the two primary questions that, from which all other research questions have derived really are: one, what is climate security? And we took up the definitional challenge first. And two, whether it is a useful analytical framework to understand and to order regional security fault lines. Now, we started with the fundamentals because, of course, of the awareness that this project and this kind of research and dialogue heavy work on climate security, whether it is the project's scope, which is rather ambitious, whether it is the approach we've taken, or it is familiarity with the subject area. And it really has been an education. Most of us, at least at IPCS, started with a blank slate in January of 2021, I'm losing track of time. We do acknowledge that it is a fairly new area of investigation for, the Indian security and foreign policy community, perhaps even the South Asian landscape. To our knowledge, nothing of this scope has been attempted before. And working with that knowledge, therefore, we started with the basics. And I am pleased to say that, we've traveled a fair distance since. Now, please do note that we have sought a much wider definition of security itself, and this ties back to what Louisa mentioned about what the Planetary Security Initiative does in terms of, the cross-sectional expertise that it draws on and also informs. So within our definition of security, we have sought to include both military and non-military referent objects. But importantly, what we've sought to do is lay equal emphasis on both of these. And I thought it would be important to flag this because, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, because we do have expert speakers coming on in a little while. I think this differs somewhat from how it has been conceptualized in other parts of the world that have military or defense thinking in the lead. But again, as I said, I'm happy to be corrected, but so far this has been our understanding, and we have tried to take a more whole of society approach in our understanding of climate security. What I will add here also is that since August last year, as part of this same project, I have had the privilege of chairing an India-specific interdisciplinary 1.5 task force on climate security, whose very interesting conclusions, while currently embargoed, actually align quite neatly with the Bay of Bengal report's findings. So I will ask you to keep an eye out for the report. It is currently in development and should be out shortly. I think I will end here for now, and I will come back on once the authors roundtable concludes. And back to you, Louisa. And thank you all once again.
Thank you, Rui. Thank you so much, and also for pointing out to the task force reports that's forthcoming and our great collaboration. For us, it was also a very good journey, and we really improved our understanding already of climate security in the Bay of Bengal, and that we will also play out. First, we would like to go now to the poll questions that we have prepared for you. So I will ask my colleague, Maya Yassin, who is running the outreach for PSI and also junior research fellow at Clingendael to start up the poll questions. Maha, can you come in with the poll questions? Yeah. So the first question to you, we have actually only 2 questions, but we wanted to know a little bit more about your background. So who is in the audience? My reason to participate in this webinar, do you have a generic interest in the topic of climate security in the Bay of Bengal? Do you want to engage in this topic? Is it new for you and do you want to learn more about it and also to see what kind of policy relevant insights you can derive from it? Or are you a person who's writing about this topic, research policy papers, and you want to hear also the different perspectives that are presented here in this webinar? Or do you have other reasons to participate today? Please. Okay, Ma, where are we with the votes? Can we already see a result? Oh, wow. So most people participate because they have the generic interests, but also the other categories are relevant for participating in today's webinar. And we, of course, are super interested also in the third category. If you're writing on this topic, please always keep us posted because we also like to promote that through our PSI channels, the website, the social media. Thank you. Maha, could you come up with the second question? So what, in your view, that's I think very relevant also for us to know, do you consider the most urgent climate risks in the Bay of Bengal? Do you then consider, sea level rise undermining livelihoods dependent on agriculture and fishing? Or do you think of coastal erosion affecting developmental and strategic assets in coastal areas? Or is the first thing that comes to your mind cyclones and floods that are displacing local populations? What would you consider urgent climate risks? So, and these risks could, of course, become a security issue, not necessarily, but this relationship might unfold. Okay, let's see the results. Ooh, here we see a rather mixed picture with all categories coming out, but especially the relationship with displaced populations related to the increase of cyclones and floods is coming out quite prominently. And that's quite interesting because it's also the first question that I'm later on going to pose to the authors. So let's immediately go ahead with this part of the webinar. Actually, I'm joined here with the authors of the report, Anshuman Chowdhury, Siddharth Anil Nair, Ashutosh Nagda, and Garima Maheshwari. And they have worked really hard on this report, but they have also covered, let's say, different parts of the report and different aspects and elements of the climate security in the Bay of Bengal. And I've prepared, a few questions for them, and also to see, let's say, some of the main points of the report, if we can divide them. Of course, we cannot, let's say, tell you about everything that's in the report, because then you will have to go to it and read it. But we just wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of what you can find there. So let's start with you, Anshuman Chowdhury. In the report, you have looked at the socio-economic and political divides in India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, and how climate impacts might affect these countries. And this also includes the sensitive link between climate change and migration, which is also in this region evidently linked to also risks of instability and even violent conflict. So it's not so difficult to envisage how sea level rise and storm surges and heat waves can be a reason to contribute to reasons people might have to migrate, on top of other reasons they may have. That's always what comes out in the research on climate and migration. But I guess what's more important for policymakers working in this field is what could be done to avoid climate change being an additional driver for migration in the region. Please, Anshuman, what is your view?
Yes. Yes, I mean, climate change can indeed widen socioeconomic divides, which could then, in certain contexts, snowball into political instability and eventually, violent conflict. And as you said, migration is a key link in this chain of consequences. And if you see our paper or the report, we have explained these chains of consequences, various chains of consequences rather, in detail through infographics. So you can take it. People can go and take a look there. Now the Bay of Bengal region anyway is rife with migration-induced social tensions and what could be called insider versus outsider conflicts. This is also reflected in the current evidence-based literature, which suggests that people are already moving from coastal belts to sensitive, quote-unquote, sensitive hinterland areas due to climate threats. And in our report, we have given several other similar examples from the 5 countries that we have studied, which are India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia. So there are ample examples of climate threats directly or indirectly contributing to movement of people across borders or within borders. Now, in order for countries to prevent this from happening, we think, am I audible? Okay, sorry.
Yes,
I think
it's
there was
fine.
a problem on
Please.
my connection. Yes. Well, I think in order for countries to prevent this from happening, they need to first acknowledge in very clear terms that climate change can be a reason for people to move from one place to another. And this would then mean countries developing some monitoring capability to map climate-induced displacement within and across borders. But the problem is that migration is a very politically sensitive issue in this region. There is no consensus on what counts for migration or how to deal with irregular migration across borders. Also, many of the national legal frameworks here do not recognize irregular migration and in fact criminalize them. So I think governments will have to do 2 things here, which is 1, adapt their national political and legal frameworks to the reality of climate-induced migration, and 2, undertake extensive bilateral and multilateral discussions in order to reach some meaningful consensus on how to tackle this problem, and also, mitigate the after effects of such movements that have already taken place. On a more fundamental level, we think that the best way to prevent climate change or climate-induced migration is to build capacities and resilience at the source. That would mean making vulnerable communities aware of the emerging climate threats that they are facing and supporting them in developing short, medium, and long-term adaptation capabilities. And we think in terms of institutional regional cooperation, I think BIMSTEC provides the most comprehensive platform for collective engagement, but it needs to step up and pay targeted attention to the whys and hows of climate-induced displacement, so that it can effectively prevent it, and while also ensuring that the rights and dignity of marginalized communities are not violated. And in our paper, in the recommendation section, we have outlined in detail how this can be done and how interface within BIMSTEC can be built with the various bodies, security and climate-related organs of BIMSTEC. So our recommendation section actually details that out. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much. So BIMSTEC is really, the regional player that could address also this issue that comes out very clear. Thank you so much, Anshuman. I would now like to go to Siddharth Anil Nair. Siddharth, you have examined the probable and possible impacts of climate change on the operational readiness and force postures of regional militaries in the report. And in the report, it's argued that climate change influences military capabilities and positioning. And this could also exacerbate regional security challenges and affect the Bay of Bengal geostrategic dynamics. So, yeah, that's quite strong language and findings. So has the likelihood of violent conflict or even war, has that increased because of climate change impacting the region?
So yeah, it is a difficult question to answer, but I think as the conditions are created, that is the intensification of interstate competition and conflict, which we can see is happening around the world, and climate change intensifies, the conditions and the potential for conflict across the spectrum will go up. And the Bay of Bengal is a perfect example of how the climate change and security intersect one another. And the Bay of Bengal is also a particularly important region to look at in this regard, right? And it explains the climate security nexus very well. So the location near the Malacca Strait makes it a highly competitive environment, important for connectivity. Its own physical geography makes it highly vulnerable, right? The gradient, the elevation. It also has a large population, around 1/4 of the world. And, as we point to populations in the Indo-Pacific discourse, the Bay of Bengal rears its head. There are a lot of geo-economic factors also that make it very important. It's a sizable chunk of the global economy. And all of these factors together also make it a highly militarized space, right? And very traffic dense. So not only is there chance for confrontation, but there is also an increasing chance for mishap, really. And we also, with our case studies in our report, we've outlined, like, for example, Bashan Char in just off the coast of Bangladesh, or Vishakhapatnam in the eastern coast of India. We've taken these examples to sort of show the kind of impact that exacerbated or adverse climate threats like cyclones, frequent floods, what they could do to not only human security issues like the ones that Anshuman covered in the paper, but also hard military issues. Military assets could be destroyed, degraded, made redundant due to sea level rise. And so at the end of it all, what we know is that there's a clear link between climate and security. And the Bay of Bengal's inherent qualities combined with an exacerbating climate and a changing environment makes it a highly geopolitically risky space. And in our report, we've done our best to sort of recommend certain, or at least set the foundation for certain guardrails that could be put in place to prevent, conflict across the spectrum in the Bay of Bengal. But to answer your question, yes. And as these phenomena intensify, I think it'll hold true as it continues. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks. So yeah, military assets, but also strategic positioning is at stake. Yeah, very interesting. And also we hope to see more of that with regard to the task force outcomes as well. I would like to now go to Ashutosh Nagda and also to move more to the eastern part of the Bay of Bengal region. Ashutosh, you have looked at Sri Lanka and Indonesia, or quite a conflict-prone part of that immense country, Indonesia, called Aceh, which is also, in this independence battle. Many of us will also recall the conflict history with the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. So clearly, a sensitive part of the region. So what did you find? Is climate change now the new enemy for the region and for these two countries? Or could it perhaps also be used as a kind of common enemy to bring together conflicting parties and lead to a new agenda for peace building and dialogue? Ashutosh, please.
Yeah, thank you and hello everyone. So since there are two parts, on the first part specifically to start with, to call climate change as a new enemy is yet a tough acceptance to make. But as is the case across the globe, climate change is a growing threat for both Sri Lanka and Indonesia. The acknowledgement of the same can be, understood through the state-specific positions and policies, which we have noted in the chapter 3 of our report. But while there is the recognition of climate change and its effects, what is lacking is, or what is slow, is the implementation of the related policies, and something which we again have noted in chapter 3. But very importantly, what is missing is the focus on the interlinkage between climate change and security, and which is again the core of this report. So, and this specific combination, in our view, is the potential enemy, to use that word, but specifically from the human security point of view, because of the aggravating nature of the climate risks on the existing fault lines. So rising temperatures, sea level rise, frequent cyclonic events, etc., could exhaust coastal livelihoods and force communities to migrate to the hinterlands. And what Anshuman mentioned in earlier about the chain of consequences. That is a good context for this specific thing, which I would request everyone to take a look at in the report. To just give a very quick example, it would be of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's northern and eastern parts are inhabited by minority Tamils and Muslims, and are predominantly identified as dry zones, predicted to face severe water scarcity. So now, combined with SLR, water scarcity, both of them would impact livelihoods. This could then lead to displacement of minorities to majority of Senali's areas. So where then there's a potential, potential for an exacerbated Tamil versus Senalese conflict, and again an aggravated, which ongoing sectarian conflict between the Senalis and Muslims, which has aggravated quite a bit after 2019. On the second part of whether climate change as a common enemy can lead to a renewed agenda for dialogue, I think that's a very interesting thought and proposition. There is a precedent in Aceh as well on the similar lines, like right after the 2004 tsunami. The tsunami was one of the key drivers to the peace process talks between the Free Aceh movement and the Indonesian government. So there is a precedent for that, and that's an interesting proposition again. But ideally, any dialogues or steps to tackle climate change should be tackled through a coordinated effort, especially by taking the affected on the board. And it's important to keep in mind that in any such effort, the marginalized are not further marginalized, because again, both there is this, the ethno-religious minorities and the ethno-religious conflicts are what were the core of these conflicts, and something which we'll have to keep in mind. So yeah, marginalized shouldn't be further marginalized and not taken advantage of, and I think that would be a good way forward. Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, and also very interesting to hear that the tsunami, which is of course not a climate-related natural disaster, but that it was also used for a common agenda and to make this potential similarity to the climate security agenda. Very interesting. Thank you, Ashutosh. Then I would like to go to Garima Maheshwari. She actually joined the group of authors as an environmental or climate change expert. And we know, of course, in the climate security community that among environmental and climate change activists, there is at times also a bit of a lack of, let's say, in understanding of why it is relevant to look at the security dimension of climate impacts. I mean, the deteriorating situation of Mother Earth due to climate change is bad enough in itself. So, and it's also very clear that climate change undermines economic development. So, yeah, why is it still necessary to also look at the security implications on top of that? Do we need an additional justification? Do we still need it for climate action and environmental protection? Or might there be more of a political agenda behind this securitization? What do you say about this, Garima, based on your analysis of climate security in the Bay of Bengal region? Please.
Thank you for the question. And so, yeah, despite the scale of climate emergency facing us, it appears that we still need more justifications to incentivize climate action. And the reason mainly for this is that climate change is it's a collective action dilemma in which domestic action by countries is foregrounded in their global commitments. So as such, collective response, governance, and all of that is hampered by a typical free rider dilemma, which is associated with the public goods provision, such as the provision of a good like climate stability. So whether at a global level or at a regional level. So in such a context, security lens, like you said, it partially, I think it provides a lens for incentivizing this kind of climate action by linking climate change directly or indirectly to the threat posed to traditional as well as non-traditional national security assets. However, coming to the political aspect of it, so well, yeah, the manner in which climate security debates have played out at forums such as the Security Council, well, it reveals the political divides between the developed and developing countries, and I think for good reasons. However, the issue is mainly limited to whether climate security should be placed on the Security Council agenda or not. So, because the simple reason is that, as we have even explored in the project, that veto-wielding permanent members can then have the opportunity to steer the climate change debate in what is perceived by the developing countries to be an undemocratic and emergency framing manner. So, however, climate security, when it is seen beyond the context of Security Council or beyond the overall global context, which is quite contentious, and at a regional and domestic level, then there are avenues and opportunities for carrying this agenda forward. Various such possibilities have been explored in the report, and especially when this discourse is integrated with the lens of adaptation and resilience and focused on local communities, then it enhances that even more. So like we explored in the sections on individual policies of the countries. So how in the global south, it's overwhelmingly, even the security dimension is seen through the lens of adaptation and resilience and through the whole idea of human security. So yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks. Yeah, and I think a very nuanced picture. Eh? So yes, sometimes the security dimension is used as an additional argument by some, but we also identify this security dimension in specific regions, such as the Bay of Bengal, as testified with this report. But yeah, there is also quite a lot of politics surrounding this topic of climate security, and it's also good to take that into consideration and to understand more about the different perspectives and where they are coming from. So thank you so much, Garima. This was really well thought through. Now I would like to go over to the panel. So thank you to the authors, and thank you for your hard work on this report. And yeah, we might still have questions for you in the Q&A after the panel. Let's see how that's going to work out. Yes, so over to the panel. We see that the security dimension clearly is not uncontested. At the same time, we see from the reports how climate change in the Bay of Bengal region aggravates tensions, incentivizes additional migration, and even may alter military capabilities and positioning. What does this mean for the regional and international security environment? And how is climate change also a global security risks potentially? Rui, over to you and the panelists.
Thank you, Louisa. Excellent place to segue from, actually. But before I do that, I would like to say that I am very honored to be chairing this power-packed panel. You have already introduced the distinguished panelists, so I will jump right in, and I will begin the proceedings with Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri. Ambassador Puri, if I may actually ask you to start us off with your responses to two questions. First, of course, your general observations on the report itself. You know, what are the things that stood out to you? Are there conclusions that you don't agree with, etc.? Whatever you'd like to weigh in on. And two, I will pick up from where Garima and Louisa left off. And I hope you'll allow me to stir the pot a bit. But where does climate security figure in the Indian foreign policy discourse, if at all? And do you think that, you know, India's admittedly rational objection to climate security being taken up at the United Nations Security Council, should that prevent or preclude a consideration of its merits as an approach, of the value it could have from a policy perspective? And do you see this, and by this I mean climate security, being backed at any point in the near future by political will in India? Over to you, Ambassador.
Rui, thank you, and thank you, Louisa. I don't know the answer to the last one because politics trumps everything. So what gets decided tomorrow, we don't know. It'll have to be seen and it needs to be contextualized, and that's why lots of political decisions take place. So Rui, you've heard my views on this. I've said so earlier also. I want to start by saying I sort of skimmed through your report. I read the first chapter and I read the last chapter carefully, and I read some of the recommendations. I want to compliment you. It's a good report. You put it together very well. These people have worked very hard. But as I was hearing all your people who have authored various sections, I couldn't help laugh, and I'm glad you removed the video at that stage. Because, even though they did the report, they remained healthy skeptics. So, these ideas of securitizing, and when I mean securitizing, you actually are not so much interested in human security, welfare, or even national security, but much more into what is called international peace and security. That leaves them befuddled, and rightly so. And I think one of them actually said, look, I'm not sure if I can answer that question. Look, these are ideas which quintessentially come from people who are busybodies, so I won't get into all of that. But I want to, compliment you all and take some of the things. So issues such as climate being integrated with, let's say, strategies of military defense, etc. But obviously, I mean, supposing, you are building a deep water port, a military base on the seaside, you should today take into account seawater rises, possibilities of typhoon. Though that particular recommendation, I don't think needs any challenge. It should be accepted, and it is already accepted. India has a wonderful case of Karwar, the base, where actually people stepped back and said, look, let's do a little bit more work because we are going to face challenges of sea level rise, global warming, etc. So many of these things are very much on. And let me also say this. Obviously, climate change exacerbates national security. There's absolutely no doubt because so many of the challenges get further. And, military is not the answer. Somebody asked a very good question in the chat box. National security, can military find the answer? Of course not. They can't find an answer for themselves. These are existentialist issues, far more important, far more serious that impact society. Let's take the case of the COVID pandemic. Which country threw in the military to try and solve the problem? Nobody. They don't have the answers. So these issues are completely different. And I wish that the securitization aspects looked at human security and so on. But having said this, let me say, climate change in the Bay of Bengal, and I'm trying to limit myself to Bay of Bengal, is a very serious and a major issue. Sea level rises would need huge amounts of adaptation. I don't want to get into this business of migration because it's a very easy subject to just throw it out there. But reasons, let me take the recent cases of migration. You can keep tracing them back to climate change, but there are proximate reasons. And it's proximate reasons which are going to result in the way the world is going to do. So conflict within the Bay of Bengal, outside powers, yes. Within the countries, I just don't see that happening at all. And so trying to find an answer is a different matter altogether. So let me look at your report and let me, go straight away to it. Your report in the very first page number 4, has some 6, if I may say so, key findings. The last one is absolutely spot on. There's no issue. The first 3, I don't think so. There are no such serious things. The fact that the area is militarized as a result of, China, the United States, etc. Yes, there are issues. But where are the critical issues? For a very long time, they're going to be far more on the eastern side of things. And so, therefore, I think, by bringing these kind of things, and let me tell you, it's not that these are not in the minds of people. They are, but they are not there because of climate change. And climate change is not going to really exacerbate them. They're going to be exacerbated because of hegemonistic tendencies, wanting to retain status quo, and so on and so forth, great power politics. That's exactly the kind of stuff which is happening. Things such as major long-term threat, no, major long-term challenge. So if you start removing the word threat and put the word challenge, the report will read perfectly fine, as good as anything else, and yet leave us away from this whole business of somebody saying, why don't you call in the military to solve the problem? Let me, Rui, before I end, and I'm happy to take questions and, make it contrarian. So I said, we look at your recommendations. The very first one is a very good one about BIMSTEC being a linchpin of it. Obviously, we're talking of the Bay of Bengal. If we remove the word, or even if we leave this word, climate security, but define security as resilience, your entire thing reads differently and reads far better. And what is the role of these NSAs? Worldwide, we have defined them in a particular manner to deal with a particular subject. They have no expertise, no ability to be able to deal with matters of this kind, which are truly holistic and which really demand massive amount of a holistic understanding, way beyond those who come from the segment of a very narrow definition of security. So this, in my opinion, is one of the things. When you look at your second recommendation, let's start by understanding one thing. The greatest need of the hour is adaptation. But let's not define adaptation as merely battling with disasters. That's one component. Frankly speaking, you need to start adaptation to change so many things from the way you've been doing them. And this not only means bringing in solar power, etc., but let me tell you, our buildings are built to certain standards. If the temperature levels generally go up slightly more, you need to start doing them differently. Your entire systems are developed on a certain way. That is the crux of adaptation much more. Of course, disaster response, etc., are important, but up to a point in that way. The third, fourth one, all these can be accepted. Fifth is absolutely in order. And as regards SAR, I would like something to happen with SAR. Frankly speaking, nothing is happening. And so at this time, a far better and much more valuable recommendation from your side is your first one. And I think very rightly you put SAR down at the sixth position. Let me stop, Rui. I'll take questions happily. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Puri. We weren't expecting you to mince your words, which is fantastic because it provokes further discussion. I think where we agreed is, on the value of the meaning of climate security itself. Where we are also agreed is the potential for political narrative capture. And this is something I am writing on. And of course, this is a lexical problem, which is where did the terminology emerge and how it is being politicized on international platforms. But otherwise, thank you very much for both pointing out, what works from the report and what you think doesn't work, as well as the limitations of this particular approach. We will go into the question and answer round after we go through all the panelists. So for this now, if I could please turn to Ambassador Riaz Hamidullah, who was introduced by Louisa earlier. But what I will mention is that I discovered in a conversation with Ambassador Hamidullah that he served in Delhi at the beginning of his career and is in fact well acquainted with IPCS. So welcome back, Ambassador. I will ask you a similar set of questions that I asked of Ambassador Puri. First, of course, your thoughts on the report itself. And I wonder if you'd like to, one, of course, respond to Ambassador Puri's reservations about how the approach of climate security is being appropriated and politicized, while agreeing that and this is my distillation of his observations, while agreeing that it could serve a useful purpose for the region. So oppose the global narrative capture, but see what utility it has from a regional perspective. So in that regard, I would be interested in hearing from you what role, if any, climate security has in the Bangladeshi national security discourse. And perhaps a little bit more about regional cooperations and regional cooperation and the platforms that could facilitate that. But before I turn to you, Ambassador Puri, I also wanted to mention, in terms of provoking disagreement, that in case you would like to come in between the conversation, please feel free to do so. Ambassador Hamidullah.
Thank you, Ruhi. This conversation, and starting with Ambassador Puri's some of the words, actually remind me of an Adelphi paper that I came across as long as back, I think 1996, where first time I was introduced. I think that was coming from IISS on climate security. Why I say? Because when I look at climate security and Bay of Bengal and the linkages, I think things are not as straightforward as we may look. Some of the things, particularly as a difficult proposition as mobility or migration, internal and external, beyond the borders, I think we have explored. Let me flash this. This is a product of some people's 10 years work tracking people at the community level, at the climate hotspots, and to understand why and where, how, what are the drivers, what actually come to people's mind in thousands and hundreds and thousands to move from their when they are cause climate change. The picture in the cover should speak of it all. These are the real vulnerable people. It's been work of 10 years work, very closely working. Now, why I bring this climate security, securitization of climate change discourse, I think has quite long been dealt with. And then in relation to that, paragraph 14F of Copenhagen should be a pointer. I need not explain what and how, why and how. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has quite on occasions referred to climate security or climate change was an existential challenge in Davos, Munich, Paris, etc. But I must underline, when she was referring to, she was not referring to in terms of climate change as causing or posing a threat as traditional threat, as a security threat, as a military threat. She was saying it's more of livelihood, of lives, and of economic threat. And that's why I very humbly urge that the whole space need to be looked at in terms of the causal linkages a little more carefully. I fully applaud the work that you have done, but I would say that this is a first attempt, but also we need to understand and go a little more because not only the facts and figures, but also the causal linkages in terms of people's perception. End of the day, it's the people. It's the people who feel that, yes, I feel threatened. A farmer who says that in the farm fields that no, the heat is increasing compared to the last year. So he feels that there's a heat stress, and that so climate change, as much as we established, but there's also the people who says that I'm feeling the threat of climate change. The pathogens on the fields are increasing. In the hospitals, the doctors are saying the pathogens are increased. There are new pathogens emerge. These are the facets. So put together, I think when we define climate security, then we need to understand it's a very intricate interplay of humans, of environment, and of economics. How and where did we play, in which society, which country, which economy are very different. If you want to generalize, I think we need to proceed a little carefully. When I look at the report, and I think you have looked at the region as a whole, and also in relation to SAARC and BIMSTEC, I've worked that space, or having worked that space, let me tell, I think we need to bring the whole architecture in 3 layers, as has been in case of Agenda 2030. We need to look at the subnational, national obviously, but sub-regional is important in South Asia or in our region, also in BIMSTEC, because it is not a monolith that we are dealing with. If you go to, let's say, Maldives, Sri Lanka, southern India, that's one agroecology, one people kind of, and that's the behavior of commonality is one kind of. If you come to, let's say, our part, I mean, Bangladesh and around, then we see that Eastern India, Northeast India, Bangladesh, and if you expand slightly beyond Nepal, Bhutan, that's one kind of. The issues are different compared to, let's say, Western India. So I would say that when we look at that, when we try to decipher, we need to look at the sub-regional dynamics as well, rather than also simply looking at the regional. Also, in relating to the report, I think the natural resource security, how much of natural resource are in command of people, communities, in terms of ethnicities or in terms of geographic community, and how are they finding the resources, their capabilities, the command over resources depleting, that needs to be understood. And then how are they really coping, that also need to be understood. Put together, if one may ask me that how would Bangladesh, looking at whole of, if I may put it very flat, I have slight difficulty with climate security, but still for the discussion, if I take it, I think the 3 things which I will try to pose. One is we are very consciously bringing up climate adaptation. Ambassador Puri, as being a negotiator, would bear me out while we clamor so much in the COPs, but we need to understand that much of the things we cannot wait for the world. We need to pull our socks together and see. So that's why Bangladesh preaches very strongly about climate finance, climate adaptation, and technology. Now, when we say technology, I must put it, and Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has again very clearly said that we are not asking for life-enriching technologies. We are asking for life-saving technologies in health, in agriculture, in natural resource management. So for us, the pitch and entry point to deal with climate security, to tackle climate change, is sustainable development, is blue economy. That's why when I look at the whole title, Bay of Bengal, I would feel that we need to not understand Bay of Bengal like just on the line or the coastline. We need to understand also the hinterland and also expand, let's say, through our rivers, riverways, through our wetlands, through also the other climate hotspots. Bangladesh, for example, is a land where we have 10% of the land occupied by wetlands, for example. We call them howrs. You coming from Assam would understand that what I'm referring to. These are depressed lands, essentially. These are climate hotspots, frankly, as much as the coastlands are. And that's where we find a lot of stresses are coming in. So when we look at Bay of Bengal, I would assume that we are actually looking at not only the Bay of Bengal as the blue water space, but also Bay of Bengal interspersing with, let's say, the muddy water, the river waters and the wetlands. So we're looking at the whole region. It's not in exclusion of the other. And that's why we were very carefully asking in the SDG negotiation that SDG 13 must bring in a standalone SDG on climate change. And then that has a causal linkage also with the COPs. Second point is that focus on blue economy for sustainable development, because that is intrinsically linked to lives and livelihoods. And then that connects to the people or the communities who we are thinking are at risk of climate change. I must understand that we need to use the terms like threats, risks, and challenges carefully. And that also applies to the report. Because, for example, if you go to the Davos the Global Risks Report, I think the definition and the risks in terms of the likelihood and impact are very clearly defined, and it's been coming up every year, almost for 7-8 years now. And the third point is that when we look at climate change in terms of adaptation, we must look at the technology part and the people's adaptive capability part a little more carefully and deeper. Particularly at a time that while we are dealing with it, we are also facing in new times when we are going for carbon neutral world. Now, this may come almost as an inevitable, but then how does that put a Bangladeshi manufacturer or a Bangladeshi factory owner or a farmer in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in India, dealing with new norms, practices, and things which may come from global space. Thank you, Ruhi, for now, and certainly I stand ready to take any other question.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. These were very considered and specific inputs. And I do discern certain points of convergence and divergence between your inputs and Ambassador Puri's. A few
Ruhi,
things that I will...
Yeah, one thing I was to put in, and I think that would corroborate to what Ambassador Puri said. You see, last August, I think that's 6 months back, suddenly Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina made a decision and made an announcement. Bangladesh on her own decided to cancel 10 earlier approved coal-fired power plants. I did not explain what is the implication, what really led Bangladesh to do that, but please see that this is how we are coming ahead and of the curve and trying to ask others that please step forward in terms of ambition. So one is that what we are doing at the national level, but also trying to push the national discussions. Sorry.
No, not at all. And thank you. Please feel free to jump in at any point. I'm happy to be cut off. A couple of things that I will clarify about the report itself. With regard, you made a very interesting point about the Bay of Bengal as a sub-region, and that is precisely what the report has tried to do, which is, account for both the continental and the maritime. So not just see it as the Bay. And your point about a better articulation of how we've defined security is certainly also very well taken. We have accounted for, and this is a point Ambassador Puri also made earlier, we have accounted actually for traditional state definitions of security and human security equally. And this is, I think, a point I made very briefly in my introductory remarks as well. We are continuing to develop this because, of course, language plays such an important role in how the discourse is shaped. And our task force document will also contain an expanded version of that. But thank you again, Ambassador. I will now turn to Professor Meli, Caballero, Anthony. Professor, we've had, I think, quite an interesting discussion so far. One of the things that has stood out to me that both ambassadors referenced is the securitization of climate change. And this has been, I think, the fundamental basis that a lot of countries that have objected to climate security have used to express their reservations. Would you say that, the securitization of climate change, if one were to look at it differently, somewhat differently, it also means socializing those, I would even use myself as an example, someone who works on so-called traditional security and foreign policy issues, to socialize us and, for instance, people who work in the defense establishment to the security impacts of climate change. Do you think that viewing it in that way, while also acknowledging that an overt and too much securitization of climate change might be a bad thing? Do you think these things go here or they go together? And I would be very interested in hearing from you on this, especially from your experience in shaping the discourse on climate security in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruhi. And before I respond to your question, I would also just want to congratulate the team for what I think is a very excellent and well-researched report. If anything, and I will link this to my response, is the report allows for connection of the dots that often we don't see when we look at certain things in more narrow, or some would use siloed kind of lenses. And that is what the report has done. And of course, as the previous ambassador Puri has mentioned, that perhaps it needs a bit of nuance, and that's really where, as a start, it's a good project to start with, and it will spawn onto many other studies. So why use climate security? And securitization is just a way to frame an issue, which to different audiences allows them to present sobering realities about how individuals, groups, and communities really feel about the kind of risk and threats that they face. So if you go strictly by the theory of securitization, is really just a speech act, right? The problem is when you talk about securitization as militarization, they're two different things actually, right? Securitization is anybody can appropriate the language of security, because if you ask anybody else, what is a security threat to you, right? Then the things that we have talked about, the impact of climate change, whether it is forced displacement, whether it's real physical threat to lives because of this catastrophic national hazards, food insecurity, water insecurity. These are all security issues that are framed, that are uttered, that are expressed by different groups. And if you talk about human security, really, from the way it started, this is really the issues that, different communities use. So I don't see a problem with, the Speech Act itself. What's problematic is in the process of doing so, then it gets into the realm of, more militarized response. But I don't see until, of course, we have come to a situation where the melting of the ice sheets have created new zones for contestation where it requires a military response. But many of the impacts of climate change outlined in your report and is also expressed in other kinds of reports in the region are very real security challenges for both communities or individuals and the state. So things like this, when you say climate and security or climate security, actually brings front and center some of the things that we have taken for granted if we just go and limit ourselves to the more traditional state-centric approach to security that looks at competition, power, military power, etc. And then going to Southeast Asia, I mean, there's no problem with it, because in the way, if you look at the agendas, particularly when it comes to, whether it's political security, whether it's economic or sociocultural, looks at health, environment, etc., climate change is integrated in many of these agenda. So that to me is really not an issue if you agree to the premise that anybody can appropriate the language of security, and that has truth, because these are really, if you talk about everyday politics, this is everyday security issues of many individuals across the region. So yes, I see the merit of such a framing. What is challenging is really when you talk about, is this impact, because there are multiple threats, will this immediately lead to, say, confrontation over resources like water, for example? Well, we can see that in the Mekong in Southeast Asia, there's already some concerns about water flow, especially among the riparian states. And this is not only because of some dams that are being built, but really because of the impact of climate change, the long droughts, for example. And these are riparian states that are also food producing countries. So this is a concern, right? So one is if we understand, and the science is there, but sometimes it's hard to appreciate, right? That if we agree that many of these issues, if they're not unattended, if there's very poor adaptive capacity, if there's poor governance vis-a-vis an increasing demand for state services, right? And increasing demand for competition of resources, which could then spawn into conflict, particularly among those that have been marginalized, but are also involved in some kind of fight or cause for independence or for secession. We saw that in the case in Southeast Asia, we have those cases, So climate change indirectly is not often a direct cause to conflict, but if you don't attend to the impacts of climate change, right? If they're unattended for many other reasons, then the likelihood of conflict is there. And that is, I think, where climate security best captures that kind of dynamics. I'll leave it there. And have I answered your question, or is there any other?
Absolutely, and very eloquently. Thank you very much, Professor. I think what you've done is one, of course, you've given us an overview of what the approach means, but you've also outlined its definition in a sense, but also its purpose, going beyond, I think, the political challenges of the terminology itself. So thank you very much. An eloquent and dignified contrarian view, if I may say. I will now move on to our final panelist today, who is Dr. Florian Kramper. I hope I have not butchered your name. Can I ask you, you have been working on this issue for, I think, far longer than a majority of both this panel and, sorry, not the panel, but, all the speakers here. And I wonder whether that includes the audience as well. What has been the value of this approach for you to your research? And I wonder whether you can also weigh in on how the findings of the report, our report, compare with your conclusions with regard to some of the other geographic areas that you investigate.
Thank you, Rui. I almost feel old now. But thank you so much, and congratulations also from me to the also team for an excellent report that I think is really important and well taken, and a great contribution for the discussions in the region. I'll try to answer your question, but I'm actually triggered by all the excellent contributions that were coming before. And if you allow me, I will start slightly different. And I think I will end up answering your question along that way. But I want to pick up on the last point that Meli made so eloquently around securitization, right? And I'm honestly so tired of that argument. Securitization does not mean militarization. It means we are making the issue an important issue where we need extraordinary means. And if you think about the climate change global discourse, maybe that's what we need. We don't need the military to fight it, right? Because that doesn't work, but we need extraordinary means to fight climate change and have successful climate mitigation efforts. So at CIPRI, we're working on climate security over the last couple of years, and I think that is an important consideration to take, because probably most of you do not know CIPRI as an institute that is focusing on a soft issue like climate change. You will know it for work on arms, nuclear proliferation, arms trade, military expenditure, all of these things. Today, the climate team is the biggest team at CIPRI, right? And I think I'm telling you that not to show off how big a team we have, but I think something has changed. The security landscape has changed. And that is another argument why the securitization argument is so not helpful, because we're operating in a new security space. And I want to put that a little bit into context. You mentioned before in the question to Ambassador Puri, the Security Council, for instance, right? I do not want climate security to be an issue in the Security Council, but it will be, right? And actually it already is, if we want that or not. At this moment, 6 out of the 10 largest UN peace operations, all authorized by the Security Council, are in climate security hotspots. 80% of all deployed personnel in these missions is in areas highly exposed to climate change. Climate security has arrived at the Security Council, if you want it or not, right? That is the factor. The countries discussed in the Peace Building Commission, all highly exposed to climate security. We're seeing this overlap. So where I strongly agree with what was said before, and also with Ambassador Puri, language is really important. And that is something that we have focused on very significantly in our work on climate security. We're talking about climate-related security risks. And I would echo the suggestions on a different framing, probably. I don't think the threat framing is helpful at all in this space. The focus we have taken is to emphasize risks, because all of these things, and you see that in the report, and you see that in the work that is coming out on climate security, is that human security is at the center. And I think the South Asian and Southeast Asian region are some that show us that more significantly actually at others. We see that in the work we did. If we think about what the security implication is, right? We're not talking about civil wars, we're talking about protests and grievances and other issues, which you also cover in the report quite eloquently. But it also brings up questions on responses. So what we know from research is that climate change increases the risks of violence, various types of violence, and human insecurity. But we see that human insecurity caused by climate change is increasingly becoming hard security challenges in various areas. Hence, it ends up in the Security Council and other spaces. But what are the solutions? The military is not the solution. We do not fight climate change with military means, right? So we need other solutions that are, and there was a question in the chat around governance, right? The question, that is an absolutely important factor. It has a lot to do with adaptive capacity, with all these things. We need to come to an understanding here where climate action is peace building and its development, right? We cannot separate those issues, because that is what this changed security space is. It is a space where all these factors come actually together.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you for these observations, especially about the criticality of language, which is of great personal interest to me as well, quite apart from, us handling its implications institutionally. And I think the point you make about threats versus risks is especially useful. I will make a point about securitization, which both you and Meli spoke about. I'm completely agreed, but I do wonder whether this view will find currency with policymakers, especially in our part of the world, whether this broadening of the analytical lens of security and a recognition, as Meli mentioned, of our everyday security challenges, and really all of us being in a position to appropriate the word security to define the risks that we face. I wonder whether that is going to be politically feasible in this context, and I will flag this for further discussion should we have the time. But I was really hoping for a second round of discussions with the panelists, but it looks like we may be out of time, and I don't want to use language not appropriate for a panel. I don't want to hog you all to myself. And I think we have several questions from the audience. So before I hand over to Luisa, I would like to thank you all very much. I thought this was an incredibly considered and detailed discussion, and especially incredible because we were able to, fit it all in a fairly short span of time. And I think there are several triggers here that we could be using for further research. So thank you all very much. And back to you, Luisa.
Hi, thank you, Rui. I will indeed go on. We have several very good questions in the Q&A. And I think already Florian answered one of the questions posed by Melvin van der Veen about governance also possibly increasing climate risks. And we know, of course, of the studies also of maladaptation and climate adaptations, which might not be climate conflict sensitive because they benefit one constituency over the others in receiving, for instance, climate finance and aid and resilience building. So indeed, this governance aspect is very prominent. And I would also like to mention that some of the remarks made and suggestions made, also I saw a very good question about gender, are issues that we look on in other parts and that we will have publications about in the future and that we will address. I would like to ask maybe if Ashutosh could reflect on the question by Ambassador Martin van den Berg. He's the ambassador of the Netherlands to India, but he posed actually a question about Indonesia, about the example of environmental peace building in Indonesia. And we've also come across in the Planetary Security Initiative, for instance, that they had a Crops for Peace initiative in which they also wanted to, let's say, accommodate natural resource management into their peace building process at a certain point in time. So Ashutosh, could you say a few more words about Indonesia? And I would also like to apologize if I have some noise in the back, because somehow in my street, some people have started to dig and lay new internet cables, apparently. So I hope that you don't hear this if I'm speaking in the headset. Ashutosh, please.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
So the question is really, can you say maybe a few more words about what we can learn from let's say Indonesia and the potential that there might be in Indonesia to use climate change as a new entry point for peace dialogues, so the issue that we discussed previously.
All right. Just in terms of the context, I would say, as I said in my presentation as well, the tsunami in that case was one of the triggers. A very primary triggers was the democratization process of the Indonesian government at that stage. So in terms of what the learning is that when there are these two new processes which are developing, a government which is developing and some sort of pressure from the environment which was developing at that stage from Aceh, these two are combining together well. So similarly, in the current stage, which we are here, but when we are discussing, I think where everyone, when it's a developing process, I think that's a very prominent learning from there, that a newer challenge is somewhere they are taking it together, and something that's one of the primary learnings I see from the example of 2004. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. And this might also be something that we delve into deeper in the continuation of the project, and also the overview on climate security practices that we have on the Planetary Security website. We're always very interested in let's say such potential cases or actual cases. I wanted to go back to this military issue, because apparently that generates a lot of debate. We've also expressed some viewpoints on this issue. Could we go back to Siddharth and ask you, Varun Mohan in the chat asks, what kind of military response would you then envisage? So people say, well, the military is not going to undertake climate action. Yeah, surely. But yeah, their assets will be affected potentially by flood risks and by storm surges. The calls for the military because of climate change might be on the rise because of the impacts on conflict and security across the world. We heard Florian talking about the UN peacekeeping operation in so many climate security hotspot regions. So how could you say a few more words about how that could look like, Siddharth? And then maybe some of the other panelists would also like to respond to that question. Siddharth, please.
So I think there's a general worry, as like even Florian said, that the term securitization doesn't necessarily mean militarization. But I think the reason why we're having this discussion, especially when we're talking about the military and climate change, is that there is a recognition that there are certain capabilities that the military has to supplement the general agenda or the overarching, more important agenda for resilience, adaptation, mitigation, and so on, right? But the other issue that is brought up is that climate change doesn't have any influence on conflict across the spectrum. And I think that's simply because people usually consider, or we, when we are looking at climate change, we tend to consider it itself as its own independent actor. I think that's even like the question that was asked to Ashutosh, right? Is it the new enemy? And we see it as sort of an agent that is physically changing the environment, that is creating conditions that could affect the way that people live. And I think given that we know now, and we've established now, that there are these impacts that it has on local socioeconomic factors, and in such a highly globalized world today, there's nothing known as the local. Everything is cross-border, trans-regional, and it demands a wider response and as many hands that could help, really, to be honest. If there is a recognition that it is existential, not only to the human, I think there should also be a recognition that it is existential to the state itself, right? And so even in the Bay of Bengal, for example, while it is the human that is at risk, whether it is cyclones, sea level rise, drought, floods, the response to it has to be holistic in such a way that we are giving it that importance, that high level importance, right? And just quickly go back to this whole, the conditions of climate change that are being created, is that we're living in a highly territorial world, right? Like we're seeing competition move from covert to overt, confrontation is becoming more and more frequent. And at the same time, we're also living in a world that is literally sinking, right? So growing territoriality and limited territory, the equation is kind of obvious that it could lead to conflict of any.
Thank you, Siddharth. And I think I saw 3 panelists raising their hands. I think this point is also excellent for Meli, because she is looking into these non-traditional security threats, but we see indeed this rise of great power politics and almost, going back to discussions about spheres of influence, territorial rights. So how is this topic that we're sinking literally at the same time, as you mentioned, affecting that? But maybe you also wanted to say something else, Meli. Please feel free to enter.
Yeah, two things, I think. I just wanted to touch on Indonesia as well, because I'm more, if there is any region, in Indonesia or in Southeast Asia, we always have this joke that Indonesia is, and this is by the Indonesians, that Indonesia is like a supermarket of natural disasters, right? You name it, they have it, from cyclones to whatever, typhoons. And because of this, and increasingly becoming more frequent as a result of extreme weather, climate, etc., the Indonesian government has really, together with other countries in the region, has put this dealing with climate change and its impact, you could say natural, humanitarian assistance and disaster management, as really a very important component of national efforts and, of course, regional efforts. And I will come to that in a while. But at the same time, when you talk about, I like what Florian said about it needs extraordinary means to respond. And extraordinary means also means the inclusion of several actors that are responsible for peace and security. Because if you look at how you have to address the impact, the results, the consequences of climate change, whether you want to address the food insecurity of displaced population, those that have also been, the displacement, their safety, their human rights, you talk about providing to ensure that, the kind of economic displacement that have been faced. Attending to these issues are actually peace building efforts. If you look at peace, not from the absence of conflict, but positive peace, where you address many of these issues that will actually enable peace, particularly in settings where there's a lot of inequality, there's a lot of marginalization and exclusion. So by dealing with this directly through your climate change adaptation measures or dealing with immediate disaster relief and humanitarian efforts, you are actually also, you're actually enabling, creating positive peace, right? So in the tsunami in Aceh, it was a means because suddenly they found that they could not continue with the conflict because there was so much displacement, so much suffering, the government had to change tack, right? But beyond Aceh, there are a lot of crises and natural disasters that's happening. So the responses of governments have to be tuned into the kind of needs that have been created, that has resulted as a result of climate change. Now, the role of the military. Yeah, sure. When it comes to the impact of, sinking landmass, where you worry about territoriality, yes, they're there. That's the traditional role. But as we can see, and this is manifested in many of the exercises, humanitarian HIDR to be short, humanitarian assistance to disaster relief exercises that's happening in the region, right? The militaries are so much involved because of their capacity. And when it comes to immediate disaster relief and assistance, they have to be around. Now, there were concerns about the humanitarian actors, and this is very much a big topic in the region, that, when the military is involved, then it's a different dynamics altogether. But humanitarian assistance, as we all know, right, is a long project. So the military is only there at the first instance, and humanitarian norms will say that they have to leave, right? If the other, as soon as the immediate response is done. So the military is part of the solution, and so are other actors in the society that needs to respond to a whole suite of issues and risk, where you need to protect and to provide for security of those that are affected, particularly the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you so much. Very eloquent again. I would now like to go to Ambassador Amidullah, because you also raised your hand and I think you want to add something. And then thereafter, I wanted to pose a question actually to Ambassador Puri, because there is a question in the chat about infrastructure. And at Clingendael, we're super interested in the global gateway of the EU versus the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese as potential ways for loans for infrastructure also in the Bay of Bengal region. And perhaps, making advertisement for Clingendael, could also mention that in 2023, in the context of an EU-ASEAN project, we're also going to look at climate adaptation in the ASEAN region and the EU cooperation. So I really hope to get back to you, Meli, when we get going with that part of the project. So first, I would like to go to Ambassador Hamidullah, please, on this issue of militarization or Indonesia, one of the two issues where you raised your hand, please.
I think the military role of military, engagement of military in dealing with certain nature of climate disasters, whether it's humanitarian or otherwise, I think have already been eloquently covered, not only by Meli, but also in some parts by Florian. Let me bring one instance, which I think should really provoke us. When we're looking for climate bad or climate things really going and impinging on our security, do we realize in the Bay of Bengal, for example, there is a dead zone on emergence to the extent of 60,000 square kilometers? And do we realize that it's expanding? Do you also imagine that what could be the possible significance, particularly on the lives and livelihoods of artisanal fishermen? For Bangladesh, I think these are the ones which are coming. That's why I was underlining quite a bit on sustainable development and blue economy. And having said that, I would, on a broader note, what I would urge is that bringing the regional organizations, SAARC, BIMSTEC, or maybe some other sub-regional organizations is a fair point, but it needs to be brought in a way that we desecuritize the whole debate. We have seen that in the past 2 decades. I don't have much benefit of referring to ASEAN, for instance, but we have seen, particularly if you look at the GMS, Greater Mekong, that also we have seen that. So when we look at public good and to approach that as a combination of national, sub-regional and regional, we need to bring in a way so that the actors, stakeholders feel comfortable. We have seen it enough in our part of the world. And that's why when you desecuritize, we actually desensitize the whole discussion. So this is important. When we do that, then we have seen that we can very well make people talk about it. There are a number of instances, but we can't go on that. But this is what I want to really underline. I think we can connect to the points which are coming from others as well, and particularly from Florian. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So a call for depolitization, maybe making things technical.
No, well, I said depolitization. I said desensitization.
Yeah. Well, anyways, I've argued in newspaper articles that I feel that the field of climate adaptation sometimes is a bit too technocratic, overlooking the political dimension. So we should continue this conversation, but not now, because we only have 3 minutes left of our official time for this webinar. Ambassador Puri, I wanted to ask you, because you've also been ambassador of India to the EU, and you've also been the lead negotiator on climate change. With regard to climate resilience in the Bay of Bengal region, of course, cooperation on infrastructure might be a potential field for cooperation. Also because the region has basically the same regional climate conditions and architecture. I was wondering how you look at that. We also heard Ambassador Hamidullah talking about the closure of coal power plants, which is not, climate impacts, but it's also, energy is also linked to investments, dependencies, geopolitics. And the geopolitics of renewable energy, just a big report of Irina published on that. Or that was longer ago. Now it was specifically on hydrogen. So how do you view this immense challenge of investment in the region with regard to both adaptation and energy transition, please?
Luis, thank you very much. Before I answer your question, let me just make a point. This business of securitization, and I really liked Ambassador Hamidullah saying, desensitize things. It will get much more action. It isn't out of nowhere that this has been a kind of subtext of what has been discussed. that first question was not out of nowhere when the gentleman asked about the role of the military. It's because also the nature of the subject, the way you chose it and the way it got written in the report. First recommendation talks about national security advisors finding a solution. Who are these guys in any country in the world? So let me just leave it at that. I think, Florian, no matter that it has been discussed, the fact of the matter is an instrument has got a particular use. You wish to use it for various reasons. Rui puts it very nicely. This is language. Yes, we'll find the answer to the language to it. It is global power play and nothing else but it. Now let's come to something more interesting and far more fundamental. Luis, there should be no doubt that we are all developing countries and a lot of infrastructure is going to be coming up. This includes India, it includes Bangladesh. Thailand is luckier, far greater amount of development, but Myanmar and all the others in the Bay of Bengal region. And so there should be no doubt in anybody's mind that you need to ensure that all this infrastructure that you build, to the extent that you know the facts, it is climate resilient and it is attuned with the newer requirements, both in terms of, let's say, sea level rises, cyclones, disasters of those kind, but also that it is greener. It has a much smaller carbon footprint. I think these things are something which are now taken for granted. They will be part and parcel of everything. In Delhi, I am associated with an organization called TERI. One of our greatest projects is a thing called Griha, which is a house for urban agglomerations, for housing, etc. We have standards and people vie to get these standards and get them accepted because this is something that is being increasingly accepted by people. And I know that there are developmental impacts, but in the longer run, these might, and in fact, they should be in much greater state for people. I'm very glad that the European Union has taken the step of setting up a large global gateway. They are, after all, the large purveyor of funds. I mean, let's be very clear that the global savings rate is perhaps even much larger than what we talk in terms of at least proximate action against climate change. The real challenge is what? Getting the savings in the developed world to get invested in the developing world, especially all these large institutional, large countries, large society, so that there can be a global action against carbon mitigation, at the same time adaptation. There should be no doubt about it at all. I think it's a very good idea. And the European Union took some time, but I understand why it took some time, but it will be a good and major push, and a push which should be green, and that should be welcome to everyone.
All right. Well, on that note, I think I would like to thank you. I would like to thank all the other panelists. I would like to thank the authors of the report. I would also like to thank Rui Niuk for the fantastic co-moderation of the panel. As usual, we are running out of time far too early. But I think we covered a lot of ground today. We also saw how sensitive parts of these discussions are. I wanted to ask you if after the webinar people could still stay on, because we have prepared a really short questionnaire, just a short evaluation of the webinar. And we also hope really to see you back. We will continue our work also on the role of the military and we will continue our work on climate security practices. We will continue the work on climate security in Southern Asia and also, for instance, our work in Iraq. So we really hope to see you back and to stay in touch and to learn more from each other. Let's put it like that. So thank you so much. And